When you hear the word Holocaust, what comes to your mind? You would probably think of the Jewish Holocaust where 6 million Jews were massacred by the Nazis, but what if I were to tell you that there was another tragedy, much more sinister, much deadlier, and much more tragic? One that deserves even more to be described as a Holocaust but is rarely mentioned. Forgotten in the pages of history, it was as if it never happened. In the years between 1885 and 1908, some 15 million people died in the Congo Free State, victims of one of the modern world's most terrible holocausts. Yet this enormous crime has scarcely penetrated the public consciousness, the memorials, museums, or cries of never again. While the basic facts of the tragedy are well known to most historians and scholars, textbooks and encyclopedias offer only a few bland sentences about it. This neglect dishonors the memories of the millions of innocent people who died as a result of a king's greed. But how and why did this tragedy happen? To understand this, we must go back in time to the very beginning. Before the Belgian colonization and the Congolese genocide in the 19th century, Congo was a large area with the second biggest pine forest in the world. Its inhabitants had lived there for hundreds of years as they migrated from Nigeria in the 7th to 8th century CE. The country became known as the Congo Kingdom, and it had a centralized government. Most of the inhabitants were fishermen, traders, and farmers. The early Congo Kingdom expanded territorially through alliances, marriages, and partnerships. Portuguese explorers arrived in the Congo Kingdom in 1482. Portugal and the Congo Kingdom allied, and many Congolese royal families converted to Christianity. After their alliance with the Portuguese, the Congolese waged wars against other African tribes. They captured many fellow compatriots and traded them to their new allies as enslaved people. However, many Congolese were against this conversion, and civil conflicts arose. Even though the winners of these conflicts were the Christianized chiefs, the Congo Kingdom maintained its traditions and religions along with the newly arrived Christian values. The paradox of this alliance is that the Portuguese, along with the British, Dutch, and French, enslaved many free-born Congolese people with or without the permission of the kingdom's chiefdom. The Europeans used this threat of enslavement as a means of subjugating the Congolese. In the 19th century, Leopold II, the constitutional monarch of Belgium, tried to persuade the Belgian government to colonize certain areas of Africa. However, his attempts failed. In the 1880s, he decided to use the International African Association, a humanitarian organization created by him to carry out his plans. King Leopold's intentions were anything but humanitarian. Congo back then was a country full of special resources that could offer him both big revenue and low cost. Under the pretext of humanitarian purposes, he managed to legally own the Congo Kingdom. The new name given to the colonized Congo Kingdom was Congo Free State. The so-called Congo Free State was anything but. It was, in fact, a giant forced labor camp, the personal possession of Leopold II, King of Belgium. For nearly 30 years, his armed thugs forced the Congolese to extract ivory, hardwoods and wild rubber from their homeland. Many were beaten to death for failing to meet strict quotas, while millions more died from physical exhaustion, famine and infectious disease. But the worst was yet to come. The Congo Free State was not only a great source of human labor. It was one of the bloodiest European colonies in Africa, if not the bloodiest. In all, roughly half the region's people lost their lives. International outrage finally forced King Leopold to give up his hold on the land. What followed, however, was what would be called the Great Forgetting. Forgetting was easy, because the Congolese were a poor, mostly illiterate people lacking the technologies needed to disseminate the fact of their suffering. Leopold ran an effective public relations campaign, helping to bury the extent of his crime for many years. When Leopold colonized Congo, it was a country full of potential and rich sources. However, most of the sources such as copper, gold, and diamonds would take time and money to generate good revenue for the colonizers. Leopold therefore decided that the main Congolese products would be rubber and ivory. These products, though very profitable, proved to be too difficult for the local inhabitants to collect. The only way to get them to work hard without wages was through force. King Leopold hired an army made up of European and Congolese soldiers, the force Bleak, to impose his sovereignty upon the local inhabitants. King Leopold was praised in Europe for his actions against the slave-trading Congo led by the Arabs, the new constructions in Congo, and the civilization of the savages through religion. In reality, he abolished the slave trade in his new property to use the local people as his own personal slaves. The initiation into Christianity was a tactic to enslave them more easily. Additionally, the construction of new buildings only benefited the interests of the conquerors. Most of the facilities, such as the hospitals, for example, could only be used by white people. Meanwhile, the Congolese were obligated to pay taxes in kind to their new European king, most of the time at the expense of their nutrition, health, and survival. The demand for rubber and ivory from the Western market was so large that even the millions of people in this big country could not cope with it. Rubber plants were grown in the forests, far away from homes. The local peasantry was forced to go there every day to collect the milk from the trees. Additionally, ivory could only be collected from elephant hunting, something even more difficult. Soon, it became too difficult for the Congolese to collect enough of the resources in the quantities their new king desired. The Force Republic quickly began to use terrorism to increase production. The Congolese villages were unable to produce the excessive amounts of ivory and rubber they were pressured for. When the production was even slightly lower than required, the men of Force Republic would commit a series of heinous crimes against the locals. The saddest part of this was that most of the men who committed the atrocities were Africans themselves who sought the favor of their white superiors who represented the imperialist European bourgeois. They were kidnapped as children, raised to be the king's soldiers or underpaid Africans. The men of Force Republic traditionally cut the lower limbs, the hands, the feet, or even the heads of the disobedient under the orders of the European officers. The mutilated parts of the victims' bodies sometimes would be eaten. Flogging the villagers and burning whole villages was also a prevalent terrorist tactic. Many Congolese died from overwork and untreated diseases like smallpox and sleeping sickness. Sexual violence against women was a daily thing. Congolese women were completely unprotected, especially when they could not pay the state taxes. White men in centuries kidnapped young girls and women, whomever they liked. Rape, sexual torture, and forced sexual slavery were the most silenced crimes of the Congolese genocide. Most of the searches in books about the colonization of Congo inform the modern audience about the mutilation atrocities but not the gendered ones. Modern Congo was the country with one of the biggest numbers of rapes and sexual torture tactics, having their roots in the colonization era. And still, the women's experiences during this era remain largely silenced. The Catholic Church also held a share in the economy of Congo. However, many missionaries returned to their homes horrified by the atrocities made by King Leopold and the rich Europeans. Some of them recorded what they saw and heard. They took photos of the victims, they took their testimonies and wrote about the horrors they witnessed. George Washington Williams was a black American historian who interviewed many Africans, victims of the white supremacy in Congo, and tried to change their lives using his voice and privileged position. Many other anti-slavery campaigners published their own experiences and sources about the Congolese genocide. However, governments only paid attention to the Congo's case after the 23-year reign of King Leopold. After the international outrage for the atrocities and the 15 million mass murders of Congolese people under the reign of King Leopold II, Belgium decided to rule Congo. Congo thus became a Belgian colony. European and American imperialists continued exploiting the Congolese people who were still living under terrible living conditions. Deaths from untreated diseases were still common, and humanitarian aid was not helping enough. In the late 1950s, the Congo National Movement took down the Belgian forces, and Congo became an independent country. To this day, violence remains a daily phenomenon. After many decades of mass murders, terror, exploitation, and seizure of their land's resources, the Congolese are still victims of international European colonization. The impact of King Leopold's reign and Belgian rule is still too huge to be forgotten, even though the history of Congo remains overlooked. In June 2022, Belgian King Felipe, Queen Mathilde and Prime Minister Alexander de Croo paid a 6-day visit to the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, on what should have been a pilgrimage of repentance for some of the most unspeakable atrocities ever visited on humanity. Yet, King Felipe refused to apologize for the Belgian crimes, perhaps because he agrees with his brother, Laurent, that Leopold was not responsible for those crimes, because he never went to Congo. That did not mean he did not line his pockets and stuff the Belgian treasury with looted Congolese wealth. King Felipe should have bowed his head in shame, be remorseful and apologized for the genocide the Belgian monarchy visited on the DRC, the follow-up brutal colonialism, and subjecting the Congolese and, by extension, the African to some of the most outrageous treatment of a people in human history. Rather he came strutting magisterially about, speaking condescendingly and, of course, being too arrogant to offer a simple apology. This is an indication that he is not sorry for the actions of his forebears, and may, like his younger brother, Prince Laurent, exonerate the monarchy from the crimes committed against a peaceful, defenseless people. Thanks for watching. For more of such videos from Critical Historian, like, share and subscribe.